Okay, hello there everyone, and welcome to today's District Administration Web Seminar. It's great to have you all with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kurt Osley-Durley. I'm the Web Seminar Editor for DA, and I'll be your moderator. The title of our event here, as you see here, is School Improvement in the ESSA Era, the Impact of Trump and DeVos, and it is being brought to you free of charge through the generous support of our sponsor for today, the Talent Development Secondary, a program of Johns Hopkins University School of Education. First, as people are still coming in here, a bit of background about our topic that we'll be looking at here today. Today we'll be taking a look at what the last 10 years of research has found when it comes to improving the most challenged and lowest performing schools and the requirements for school improvement under ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. We'll also be discussing some available sources of funding for schools and districts, as well as, of course, the potential implications of the Trump administration and Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos on these efforts. We're looking forward to a very interesting presentation and discussion here, plus live Q&A. So do stay tuned. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. But before we do, just some quick housekeeping here. If you're having any trouble listening through your computer speakers at any time, you can feel free to dial in over the phone. Just use the phone number and access code that you may have noticed we posted in the chat panel that you should see at the middle right margin of your screen there. You can dial those to get audio access over the phone if you need it at any time. And speaking of which, you can also use that chat panel to send a message to our producer. Her name is Ashley Morgan. Just choose her name there in the Send To drop-down menu if you have any other technical problems. If you have a question for our speakers, please feel free to use the Q&A panel at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen there. Feel free to ask a question at any time as we're going here. We'll answer as many as possible when we get to the Q&A at the end. So once again, if you have a question, please feel free, type it in that Q&A box at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen at any time. Just make sure it's set to all panelists, like it shows you on the slide here. And we'll get to as many as we can at the Q&A at the end. Also, we'll make the slide deck available for you to download or share with anyone that you like, and the archived recording of our presentation here will also be available for you to review or share with any of your colleagues, but I'll tell you more about that a little bit later on. So with that, on to our program. Today we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Robert Balfanz. He's a research professor and co-director of the Talent Development Secondary, which is part of the Center for Social Organization of Schools in the Johns Hopkins School of Education. Also with us is Charles Hiteshew. He is CEO of the Talent Development Secondary there at Johns Hopkins. And we're also joined by Paula Love, president of RFPMatch. We're very fortunate to have this great panel with us, and Dr. Bob Balfanz is going to start us off here today. So with that, I'll turn it over to him. Bob, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to today's web seminar. Oh, Bob, just don't forget to unmute yourself there up at the top right if you're,
okay,
there
great.
you go.
All right, good morning and afternoon, everybody. We're going to have an informative hour here learning together about ESSA and transforming low-performing secondary schools. I'm going to start a little bit of just refresher of what's in the law and a little bit of discussion about some of the current recent events about the regulations and various things that have been going on. Then we'll talk a little bit about really deeply understanding what the challenge is with reforming low-performing secondary schools. And then finally spend some good amount of time learning about what works and what we know over the past decade has shown to make a real difference in these schools. So first, let's begin with ESSA and school improvement. And one of the first good things to know is that there's actual funding set aside for this work in ESSA, whereas under NCLB, there was a lot of mandates and a lot of requirements, but not a lot of additional funding to do the critical work of sort of whole school improvement or targeted efforts. So under ESSA, there's actually 7% of Title I funds are set aside at the state level for school improvement, and they have to pass 95% of this through to LEAs, and that's about $1 billion a year right now. And it starts in next year. These schools have got to be identified at least by then, and this money can be used to support both comprehensive and targeted supports in these identified schools. Other changes are there's no federal mandate or regulations on what specific interventions are required in these schools. For all of you that lived through NCLB and then the school improvement grant era, you know there were sort of very specific federal mandates that when you had certain levels of performance, it required you do specific things. Under ESSA, the power to design those reforms are back with the people who can do it best, which are the local people who know their schools the best with supports from their states. And the one difference, though, and it's going to make a big difference, and we're going to spend a lot of time on it, is though the districts and states now have the freedom to design what works best. For schools identified for comprehensive and targeted reform and those eligible for the additional funding, the reforms selected must be evidence-based. And what evidence-based means is defined in the law, and we will come to that very briefly. Two types of schools are targeted for reform under these efforts. The schools in most in need of reform are schools are saying need comprehensive improvement. There's two ways you end up being one of those schools. Either you are in the bottom 5% of performance as determined by your state's accountability system, or you're a high school with a graduation rate less than 67%. Either of those will get you into the being identified as needing comprehensive improvement. The first set of schools will be identified next year, and then a new set has to be identified at least every 3 years. Once a school's been identified, it's in the law that the district must conduct a needs assessment with the school and identify the set of evidence-based practices which meets those needs, and then also determine if the school has sufficient resources and operational freedoms to implement them. The state will then approve and monitor the district's plan, and if sufficient improvement is not achieved in 4 years, then the state takes stronger action. So there's still a little bit of pressure here to get better. They're leaving it to the districts and the states to figure out how to get better, but there's still some limits on how long you have to do before the state steps in. All right. Schools that need targeted reforms are those schools where there's a subgroup that's been consistently underperforming as determined by the state accountability system, and for that group of students, there must be targeted reforms. The state will annually notify districts which of schools qualify for targeted reforms, and then the schools come up with the evidence-based plan and the district monitors them. And if these schools don't get better in a sufficient amount of time, then they join the comprehensive category. To get the funding to support this work, states will make a decision, and this will vary by state. Some will use a formula and sort of give every identified school some funding. Others will make it competitive and really give it to those schools they think have submitted the best plans. So one thing to be aware of is that some schools could be required to implement these reforms but not receive additional funding. So that's going to put a premium on schools and districts being able to come up with very strong evidence-based plans that are really tailored and fine-tuned to the needs of those schools. That's what will really ensure that they'll get that competitive funding if their state goes that way. The grants will be 4 years and can include a planning period, and that's very important. One of the key things we've learned over the past decade, and as I'm sure all of everybody on this phone knows, to do big reforms, you need to plan for them, you need to build buy-in, and you need to build capacity, and that takes time. If you're told in August to go in September, your first year is going to be a planning year anyway. So the good thing about this new way to do school improvement under ESSA is it recognizes the importance of a planning period and can build that in. Okay. The other thing that you may find with your states is that they can choose to put renewed funding over those 4 years on things like do you have high fidelity implementation and are you meeting your interim indicators? So again, it'll be very important to do a plan that's implementable and have the right supports to implement that plan to get high fidelity. So if you're in one of those states, you'll be able to keep accessing those funds throughout the 4-year period. And states do need to give priority under the law to LEAs that have the greatest number of schools in need of reform, have the highest need, but have also demonstrated the greatest commitment. They keep adding in this factor that you need to also show that you're ready, willing, and interested in doing this work to access those funds. Okay. Want to just spend 1 minute on what does the law mean by evidence-based? And in here, there is a hard definition in the law that's not subject to regulation or change by the new administration. And it says that evidence-based means an activity, strategy, intervention that demonstrates a statistically significant effect on improving outcomes, student outcomes or other relevant outcomes. And then there's various levels of evidence based on whether it's a randomized test or something called a quasi-experimental test or correlational. That's a lot of detail. What really matters is that there will be certain types of studies that will qualify as evidence-based and be able to show this practice works and it can be used as part of the comprehensive improvements, and other places where practices don't have those studies, and you'll need to pair them at least with other evidence-based approaches to meet this requirement in the law. Going to move on. All right. There's been a lot of interest recently with the new administration about how much choice and vouchers relate to ESSA school improvement. And there's really just the main way that could happen is that an LEA or a consortium of LEAs could have choice options be part of their school improvement strategies for the schools in need of comprehensive or targeted reform. They could say at the LEA level that one of our improvement strategies is to give our students choice to go to better performing schools. But that would have to be an LEA decision. That cannot be imposed by the state or the feds. It would have to be a local decision to use the school improvement structures to enable choice. And most of the current ideas being discussed for vouchers are really outside of ESSA. The main one right now is the idea of using tax credits for scholarships, which would happen through the Treasury Department, not through the Education Department. So currently, there really isn't a way for vouchers per se to be made a part of the school improvement strategies under ESSA. And last week, many people have been aware that last week Congress overturned the ESSA accountability regulations. Those were really things that gave guidance to states on how to implement the law. Everything I talked about setting up what's going to happen with the ESSA and school improvement before this was based on the law, so that is not affected by those regulations being overturned. Some of the main effects of these regulations being overturned is things like the fifth indicator, which you may have heard of, which can be a non-academic indicator, or something like chronic absenteeism or school climate. There'll be less guidance on what that will be. It'll be more up to the states to decide what that is. And there'll be a little less micro subgroup reporting than would have happened if the regulations were there. There'll be more states that will sort of combine smaller subgroups into sort of what are often called, super subgroups. But other than that, everything else we mentioned here, the need for the bottom 5% to be reformed, to have a funding stream, the need for evidence-based strategies, that's all in the law and not really subject to change based on these regulations not being approved. All right, that's our setup. Now I really want to focus our time on what do we know about how we can help these schools get better and what states and local folks can do to really make a big difference in these schools and improve the chances for the kids that go to them. So the first thing is we have to understand our challenge. And here I'm using the example of low grad rate high schools. So it's possible to actually map where these 1,000 high schools are. There's about 1,000 high schools that have grad rates below 67% that are regular and vocational schools with more than 300 students. So not really alternative schools here, but regular basic high schools. There's about 1,000 left that have low grad rates below 67%. The good news is that 15 years ago, that number would have been 2,000. We've actually made a lot of improvement and learned a lot what to do with these schools over those past 15 years. But one thing we learn when we say, like, what is this challenge, is we see that half of the students, half of these schools are in districts that have very high levels of poverty. And that's going to be a critical factor we have to think about when we think about how to make these schools and what we can do to help make them get better. So share some data. What does the typical low grad rate high school look today in 2017? Well, it has a grad rate of about 57%. About 1 in 5 kids is missing 15 or more days of school. 10% are being suspended. 17% are repeating a grade. A quarter of the teachers are absent 10 or more days, right? That sends a huge signal to us. If a quarter of our teachers are missing 2 weeks, it means it's not a school that's really clicking. And they're high minority, high poverty schools. But one thing I wanted to point out is these averages can really even hide the true depth of challenge in some locales. So I have 3 examples here, one from a medium-sized sort of city that's sort of been undergoing deindustrialization, from a large suburb that's had a significant shift in population over time, and from a rural area. So not our typical struggling inner city high schools, but as we can see, all these schools have high levels of need. Their chronic absenteeism rates, could be as high as 73% in our city that's in a deindustrializing city of intense poverty. Suspensions can be a quarter to half the kids. Ninth grade retention can be a quarter of the kids. And again, very high percent minority. These are the schools that are left with low grad rates look like these schools. Only 30% are in big cities. Most are in deindustrializing towns, inner ring suburbs, and rural areas. Okay. Poverty complicates the work in these schools. And one of the biggest way it does is it makes it harder for kids to come every day, focus in class, and get their work done. That's the building blocks of success, right? That's blocking and tackling. If you can't come every day, if you can't be focused in class, if you can't get your work done, it's going to be very hard for you to succeed. And if there's lots of kids like that in a school, it's going to be very hard for the school to succeed. That's all driven by poverty, right? And we know that many of those low grad rate high schools are in the 4% of districts that account for half the chronically absent students in the U.S. So just like poverty is concentrated in different places, chronic absenteeism, which means kids missing 3 or more weeks, is also concentrated in those same places. And that's a challenge that really has to be confronted head on, because if you have a great teacher, but the kids aren't there to get the great teacher, we don't get the outcome we need. Thus, the school districts with low graduation rate high schools often face a very different set of challenges compared to other school districts. This is just a very big point, and folks that live this know this, but folks that don't live it don't know it. They tend to think, oh, we all understand why schools aren't performing. They don't have the right principal. They don't have the right teachers. They don't have the right curriculum. Figure it out, and it's pretty easy. What they don't understand is it's a fundamentally different challenge to be in a school that primarily educates high poverty kids than to be in a school that doesn't. And in the United States, we really have these concentrations of high needs surrounding by seas of better off. So in this map, basically the red and the yellow little dots are places where large numbers of kids live in concentrated poverty. The green dots are places where no children live in concentrated poverty. This just shows the Midwest. Any other part of the country is like this. We see these islands of need surrounded by seas of better off, which just makes it very hard for people to understand the depth of challenges faced in the highest need communities. Another point to keep in mind, and we wish this wasn't true in this, we just did a recent study on this, is there's no inoculation against the impacts of poverty. Really great pre-K and K is important, but that alone is not going to change the dynamics. When you live in poverty, it's an ever-evolving sort of struggle, and every day changes. So there's good days, there's bad days, things are going fine, and then something happens. So we recently did a study, and we found across 30 high-poverty middle schools that fully 1/3 of students who were academically proficient in math and English at the end of 5th grade, holy grail of ed reform, high-poverty environment, you end elementary school proficient in math and English, huge win. 1/3 of those kids, when they went to 6th grade, developed an early warning indicator of being in trouble and unlikely to graduate. Either they became chronically absent, they got in trouble, or they failed math or English, even though they're proficient in math or English, in the math and English coming in. So stuff happens in early adolescence intersecting with poverty that throws many kids off, even when they're academically proficient. So this tells us what is required are constant and adaptive supports to push back against poverty, not just a one-time inoculation. Okay. So the bottom line, the primary reason we have low-performing schools is that we have concentrated our neediest students in a subset of schools not designed for this level of challenge. This tells us that while we have to have strong school leaders and teachers, which is essential, we have to have good teachers and good leaders, it's not enough in some of the toughest places. And we started learning this from the School Improvement Grant. Because if we just change the adults and don't change the practices, we don't get the impacts we need. And so we also need to redesign how these schools are organized and supported so they are better equipped to adjust the educational challenges they face and are more able to implement evidence-based solutions tailored to their needs. So it's really about the people and the design. We have to get both those right. And too often we go one way or the other and not both and get disappointed. So now I'm going to conclude this section with just a little bit about what we've learned, what we know works in turning around low-performing middle and high schools in particular, though many of these lessons can also be applied to elementary schools. So first thing, this is what we've been trying to say, is we have to understand what the challenge is and get the analysis right. and get past this idea that all low-performing schools are the same. It's pretty straightforward what they need. We just have to go about doing it. What we've learned over time is there's 3 big types of low-performing schools. Some have locked capacity, which means there's a fair amount of adult capacity in the school, either through not good management or a misalignment between what the school was doing and the outcomes that were expected, that they're not getting the results they need. And these are the schools often where we see those dramatic improvements when we change the leadership and some of the teachers, and suddenly it zooms. Partly those new leaders played a big role in that, but also what they were doing is they were unlocking some of the capacity that already existed. There's another set of schools that with the most dynamic leaders are not enough because that school is overmatched. There's just too many needy kids and not enough adults to meet those needs. Some of those schools we saw where 75% of kids are chronically absent, or 1/3 of kids are over age for grade. In that situation, you've got to have redesign of the school along with strong adults. And when you have that challenge and you don't have the redesign and you just keep shifting new people in and they just keep cycling through, that's when you get schools that have become dysfunctional over time. And basically, they've stopped functioning away, and often many of the responses make it worse. And those schools, though the minority of schools in need of improvement, are the ones where often much more bigger reforms are needed than even a new leader and a new design, because it's been so ingrained in the school to follow dysfunctional practice. Okay. The key thing, and it's part of the law now, is to do a needs assessment of these schools. And I won't spend a lot of time here because some of it is clear, but one of the things we've learned is you really have to do this thing almost like we do in sports, like who's coming in? How are they changing every week? Like who's coming in our building in 6th grade or 9th grade? How many were chronically absent? How many had behavior issues? How many failed a class? Because if you failed a class before you go to middle school, you often internalize a failure and try to do things to avoid it. That's important to know. How many are coming in different levels below grade level? Not just like they're not proficient, but how many are close and how many are far away, because those are very different types of interventions you need in either 6th or 9th grade. If kids are relatively close and just need a little bit, or if they're multiple years behind and essentially are coming into high school without a middle grades education or middle school without an elementary education, you need a very different strategy for those kids. And then we have to think about the adults. What's the history of reform in the school? Because all of these schools have been trying to reform for 15 years, right? And it hasn't stuck. So we have to really understand that. What do people experience as successful? What do they experience as not successful? What's currently working, what's not? That's a key part of that needs assessment. And this is a very important we've learned. How does the faculty perceptions of student need compare with objective data? Because often over time when schools have struggled, the perception of need gets unaligned with the reality of the need. Adults tend to go to, oh, it's just this, it's just that. If we could just fix this, we'll be fine. If we could just get 15% of kids to leave, we'd be great. If we could just get 5 more strong teachers, we'd be good. And over time, they identify a belief of what the needs are that can often shift and not be aligned with those actual needs are, because those actual needs are quite dynamic and changing over time. So, final couple things to keep in mind. Big picture, when you're designing these evidence-based reforms, what are the 3 biggest drivers of success? One is the quality of coursework. What are students actually asked to do when they engage with their coursework? Are they actually challenged to use advanced cognitive skills and think deeply, or are they challenged just to sort of repeat what the teacher told them? You can have a class with a very engaging teacher where kids are engaged and focused, and then if they're just asked to repeat what the teacher told them in a worksheet, they haven't actually used their mind, and they won't be developing their core cognitive skills they need. After that, we have to worry about the quality of relationships. That's really what drives students to attend, focus, believe, and try. And in high poverty environments, if we don't create an environment that drives kids to attend, focus, believe, and try, poverty will push back and make it harder for them to attend, harder to focus, harder to believe, harder to try. Our counterforce to that is quality adult relationships. And use everybody in the building, from the people that greet them in the morning, to in the office, to the security guards, to the cafeteria workers. Everybody's got to be a part of that relationship building team to have kids know there's an adult in their corner that misses when they're not there, that checks to see if they get their homework done, that can counsel them if they're having trouble with a teacher or a student. Those quality adult relationships are the strongest antidote to the forces of poverty which keep kids from being able to succeed in school. And then finally, we have to make sure that we're getting equitable access to strong and supported pathways to post-secondary success including extracurriculars. It's these shaped experiences in the drama team, the debate team, the robotic team, the chess team, where adolescents are most engaged and they learn a lot of the key skills they're going to need for post-secondary success. And this is too often where attempts at equity fall short, and we just sort of reserve those for the kids, the quote, the good kids or the kids that show up, and not make sure that every kid needs to experience these shaped pathways to succeed. So, summing up what we've learned. Students don't learn without good teachers and coherent and aligned instruction and assessment and active engagement in the learning process. But for this to occur, we need to build the capacity of adults and create school conditions and learning opportunities that enable it. The best teachers with the strongest and most engaging instruction will not succeed if students do not attend, focus in class, and get their work done. For this to occur at high-poverty environments, we need to create a system of adaptive and tailored student supports at the scale and intensity required. And in our experience, we've worked with something called the Diplomas Now model over the past decade, where we really tried to put this together. And from a study that's just been done, a randomized study showing this can actually bend the river. It can actually take kids that are on the path to dropping out and turn them towards the path towards graduation. And it really is this combination of working to build adult capacity through things like teams of teachers working with common sets of kids, small learning communities and professional learning communities, instructional coaching, all those things that build adult capacity has to be paired with enhanced student supports. Using an early warning system where weekly we're monitoring students' attendance, behavior, and course performance, the ABCs of student success. We're building a tiered intervention model where we have school-wide prevention activities. We have targeted things for the kids who need mid-level targets, and we have intensive supports for the kids who need intensive supports. We recruit community partners to create success mentors to build those relationships at the scale required. And we tie this all together in a coherent package with evidence-based strategies. When we learn that, we've learned that even the most challenged schools, the schools that look like some of those in the profile with half the kids chronically absent and a quarter being suspended, a quarter being retained in grade, that those schools can make big turnarounds when we build that adult capacity and meet student needs at the scale and intensity required and use evidence-based strategies to do both and use sort of a data system to tie it all together. That's what we've learned overall makes these schools move. And now I'm going to turn it over to Charles Hiteshew and Laura Wheeldryer from Talent Development Secondary to give us perspectives of folks that do this on the ground every day and what they've learned about what it takes and some of the ways they've learned that the help that schools need to implement these comprehensive and solutions. Charles?
Great. Thanks, Bob. Kurt and Ashley, I am now connected, so you can pass the ball to me and I can advance my own slides. Okay, thank you.
You should have it now, Charles. Yep, you're coming through loud and clear.
All righty, folks. Thanks, and good afternoon. I know some of you may be snowbound. I was earlier today, but we're connected nonetheless. I look forward to the next 15 minutes of good conversation and then your Q&A. Talent Development Secondary really comprises the programmatic extension of Dr. Balfanz's research. So Talent Development Secondary has been around for about 20 years. It exists at the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University. Historically, we serve about 40 to 50 schools a year that have requested our support for comprehensive school improvement. We operate, depending on the year, between a budget of $10 million and $15 million, typically serving 15 to 20 states, and with the staff, depending again on the number of schools we're working with, about 50 to 70 staff people. This is really the core of our work. We call this the pyramid, and we've increasingly talked to our staff about when you're with a district leader, talk about working the pyramid. Obviously, there are a small number of schools in any district. In some districts, it's more than others that are dealing with monumental issues and challenges. They're the schools, the high schools that have below 67% graduation rate, or they're the 5% poorest performing middle or elementary schools in the district. For these schools, and completely aligned with the latest guidance and statutes under ESSA, we provide comprehensive support, comprehensive school improvement support. This really is for that the smallest portion of the pyramid deals with those schools that are driving the greatest number of dropouts or potential dropouts. Then we really work the pyramid down toward more schools tend to need targeted school improvement, TSI, and again, aligned with the ESSA guidance. And that's for schools that have subgroups of students that are falling way behind in grade level, proficiency, or any number of outcome indicators that require intervention. So we'll often use a more targeted approach. Maybe it's just an early warning indicator system, and we'll build the capacity of that school or that cohort of schools to deploy that system. And finally, over the years, we've developed a discrete set of tools and resources and strategies that can be applied or provided to any school that's dealing with any group or subgroup of students that is struggling for any set of reasons, instructional, life skills, behaviorally, whatever it might be. We'll do our best to provide a support, a curriculum intervention, or a resource to that school. So the full model, the top of the pyramid, is really based on 4 pillars. This is comprehensive whole school transformation. It's an intensive work. It requires us to put a school, assistant administrator in the school, really serving as an extension of that principal and his or her leadership team. And we really work on, first, the structural side of the equation. As Dr. Balfanz said, true transformation in the most challenged schools is not just an instructional response, and it's not just a structural response, and it's not just an integrated student support response. It's all 3 combined. So this first pillar gets at the structural response. So we've found with kids dealing with high levels and concentrated poverty that they need a small, intimate learning community where teams of teachers are created up to work with that cohort of students, typically a limited number of students, 75 to 90. They stay with those students all year round, and they have common planning time every day to talk about the students they share and to create interventions that make sense given the challenge at hand. The second pillar is really the instructional approach. 75% of our kids are often coming in 9th grade, and often 50% of our kids are coming to 6th grade, at least 2 to 3 years behind in grade level, and sometimes more. So there's no on-grade level approach that's going to translate into satisfaction or progress for those students, much less those teachers. So we work hard on assessing where the students are, and we work hard on trying to figure out what's the most appropriate, responsible, and sensitive way to give the kids that are at least 2 to 3 years behind in grade level an opportunity with an acceleration curricula to catch them up, to fill their basic numeracy and literacy gaps, and to try to bring them up to grade level within a year, and if not 1 year, 2 years, so they can take advantage of their district-provided course. You don't just provide a curriculum, you often have to embed school-based coaches, and then we provide instructional facilitators that rotate to schools that we work in a district, and they build the capacity of those coaches to, in turn, build the capacity of the teachers they work with, whether it's implementing our curriculum or another acceleration curriculum, or just building a regular cycle of coaching experiences so those teachers are increasingly using reflective practices and overall general instructional practices that we know work. The third pillar is really based on tiered student supports. So that gets to the integrated student support side. Again, you've got to have a structural approach, an instructional approach, and then an integrated student support approach. If you're like me, you've spent your time over the course of your career typically on either side of the equation, of the 3 sides of the equation. You're either doing instructional work, or you're doing structural work, or you're only working on integrating student support so that kids can take advantage of what's being offered in school. As we've come to realize over the last 20 years, all 3 have to be wrapped up in one, and if you're just doing one, you're missing the opportunity to affect the other side, so the side you're working on can't take advantage of the opportunities at hand. So the tiered student supports are really our way of building a system that identifies students that just need a Tier 1 support that can be provided by that teacher team. That teacher team just may need to be more cognizant or sensitive to that student's learning style because he or she learns from her counterparts in their daily meetings. The second tier, and that's kids that are falling off track, whether it's in attendance, not turning in their assignments, or they're failing for one reason or another, and they're basically saying, look, I'm getting off track. Can you help me get back on track? That's typically something that can be addressed in groups, whether it's a lesson completion session, a tutoring session. These group of kids missed this unit. We need more time with them. So that group intervention that can be provided en masse as long as there's been tight targeting of which kids fall into that category. Then there's the final tier, and that's for kids that are really dealing with a major life issue. And if that issue doesn't get intervened upon, there's nothing we do structurally or academically that's going to meet that kid's needs. And we all know what those issues are. It might be homelessness, drug and alcohol involvement. It might be trauma, death in the family, incarceration of a family member. Those kids need someone to talk to one-on-one, typically from a master level person before they can reintegrate on instructional efforts. Finally, when we do these three tiers together, and this is what we've noticed particularly on our diplomas now work, that when the three tiers come together, we often find a can-do climate emerges. Teacher teams start to feel the power of their own efficacy. They start to realize that, wow, when I bring all of our team members' perspectives together, we can start solving problems and challenges at scale, whether it's our own challenges or the challenges our kids bring to the school. So this is the whole school transformation model that talent development is most known for. What we've noticed over the past 7 years, particularly as Bob has developed the efficacy of early warning systems, is that the ABCs, as you probably all know, attendance, behavior, and course performance, when you intervene on those issues, when a kid is below a certain threshold in any one of those items, below 85% attendance, has more than 2 referrals for discipline in a year, or is flunking math and English, if that is not intervened upon between 6th and 9th grade, that student's chances of graduating on time with his or her peers is 25%. If we successfully intervene during those middle school years between 6th and 9th grade, and that kid gets that issue resolved and back on track, his or her chances go from 25% graduation to 75% graduation. So this early warning indicator system is really our attempt to develop a methodology and a standardized approach around tracking those ABCs. So we can do that by building the capacity of an existing staff person, or we can provide the staff person to build that structure within a school. Again, it basically just creates common planning time for teachers to meet around kids they share, and then it develops a resource map based on the tiers. If this kid has a Tier 2 need, what's the Tier 2 intervention we can apply? Who's the champion of getting that intervention to that student between now and next week when we meet, and report out next week to make sure he or she is getting back on track. Through a series of those meetings weekly over a year, you would be amazed at the kind of impact and progress we can make. Through diplomas now, we've basically identified kids that are off track, and typically within a year, we get roughly 50% of them back on track to graduation. So finally, the TDS tools and supports that we provide to any school that has pockets of students that are struggling, falling behind, or experiencing difficulty, we can close those gaps through assessment and then by providing our accelerated curricula, either in math or English, and we can do that from the middle school through the 11th grade. We also have extra help labs that go even deeper for kids that are further behind than 2 to 3 years. We've also developed problems of the day in math that literally help as a warm-up effort for kids to just start exercising their mathematical skills and to gain confidence about how to engage the lesson of the day. Socio-emotional development, we've developed wonderful courses over the last 10 years freshman seminar is provided to all ninth graders, typically in a Success Academy setting, allows teachers to work around that class as an anchor class, but it's typically provided in an advisory or a social studies class. Sometimes it can stand alone. It really gets at life skills, study skills, and survival skills, particularly in high poverty contexts. Teachers rave about it, students love it, and the teachers often use it as a way to integrate their efforts to complement each other around the skills that are taught in this class. So if note-taking is being taught, all the teachers in the 4 major courses can say, I'm going to integrate note-taking into my lessons this week. Same at middle school. We have a mastering the middle grades at all 6th, 7th, and 8th grade levels. So again, we can train teachers in how to implement these and provide instructional support along the way to make sure they're getting the impacts we know we can. Restorative practices is also cutting edge and starting to gain great popularity across the country. It's basically a way to train staff and students to address their issues of discipline in not traditional ways, but in ways that restore justice in a fashion that meets the needs of both the students and the instructors at the school. Consulting services will often help you apply the pyramid to your school or your district, and allows us to work in partnership with districts to identify which schools may need what intervention. And then Dr. Balfanz has been very successful with a chronic absenteeism approach piloted in New York City with Mayor Bloomberg's task force on chronic absenteeism, where he's found that just by training existing school staff and having 3 meetings a day with students identified as chronically absent can lower their chronic absentee days by 50% just by implementing these 3 meetings a week with existing staff targeted at students that are chronically absent. And then finally, we build 9th grade success academies and career academies, and we try to do that in every school that we're doing comprehensive work, but some may want just a piece of it. Not to go into too much more detail, but just wanted to give you a sense of our impact and efficacy. Brookings did a wonderful comprehensive analysis of those interventions that were most impactful and most cost-effective at each phase of an adolescent's developmental arc. And at the adolescent level in education, talent development secondary was found to be the most impactful, cost-effective way to get kids back on track to graduation and life success. So I used this chart and then blew it up a little bit. And obviously the effect size, if you know evaluation research, are strong. And TDS, just as the lead partner in diplomas now, showed through MDRC and a randomized control trial that it can literally put off-track 6th and 9th graders back on track to graduation at statistically higher rates than the control schools in our study. Talent has also generated impact on its own with a quasi-experimental study in Philadelphia back in 2005, generating the impacts that I'm showing you on that slide at the bottom. So this is interesting. One of the other lessons, or a set of lessons we've learned over the last 10 years, the greatest threats to impact when trying to transform our most challenged schools, the first and foremost is there's just not enough evidence-based practice out there. Evidence is very, very expensive to produce. It's time-consuming, and it's difficult to generate. Some of you know that only 10% of the organizations that even engage in a randomized control trial get impact. So bottom line is there's relatively few studies out there with impact. So it's very important for you to know what they are, who they are, what kind of impacts they have. Not knowing enough about the evidence that does exist, what works for everything else has typically been the customary depository. But what we've increasingly found is some of the information on there is very outdated. In fact, some of the organizations that got the impact don't exist anymore. Sometimes the sample sizes are so small that they can't really be generalizable to a broader population. And at times the designs are just too expensive and unrealistic to scale. So Evidence for ESSA is a new and rising companion piece, and I've given you the website here. It tends to be more updated. It's more user-friendly. It's more focused on education, and it screens out any noise, as we say, things that aren't no longer in operation, or small sample sizes, or those that are just unrealistic to scale. So understanding the evidence and thinking, this is something that we've noticed quite a bit, certainly toward the tail end of SIG. There's often the assumption that once I know what the cluster of interventions is, or the package of intervention is, that we can do it on our own. Some people are very good at doing it on their own. What we found is they often need help. School improvement is not a right out of the box intervention. It's got to be built in partnership with those that know how they built it, have had experience in implementing it, and know what are the key aspects of fidelity so that we don't threaten the impact of the intervention. So I would say some people can be up and running quickly, institutionalize knowledge based on their partnership, but I would say when you're trying something new, do your best to work with partners to help you get it up, established, and institutionalized. So that gives you a thorough, hopefully at least thumbnail thorough understanding of talent development and how we've served as the programmatic arm of Dr. Balfanz's research. I'm now going to turn it over to our colleague, Dr. Paula Love, known as the funding doctor in many contexts across the country, but Paula's been working with us in trying to identify how we can actually support our work across the country. And now with the Title I support, 7% for the 5% poorest performing, we've certainly got a huge head start on that. But I'm going to turn it over to Paula to give you a little more information on how you might be able to fund some of these efforts. Paula?
Thank you so much, Charles, and thank you to Bob for what a pleasure it is to hear and learn today of the positive effects and impacts on school improvement, especially as we enter this new era in education. So you need to look for those programs that are evidence-based and that provide that sustainability and improvement for long-term benefits for our students and schools in most need. But we also need to think about the funding in that regard. So whenever I think about funding, some of the things that I always look at are what are some of the key words. And if we look at the catchphrases between the NCLB and ESSA, we know that we're moving into an era right now that wants to look at well-rounded students, rooted especially in equity, and most importantly, allowing states and districts to determine their best course or their best path to better performance. So here we are. We have a new administration, and we're seeing so many changes that are happening even in ESSA right now, and we don't know what lies ahead. How do you really prepare for these funding with all of the changes that are happening and the priority swings that are occurring? Well, the future, folks, definitely is hazy. But there is one thing that we do know, and that is that the balance of power is clearly shifting from federal authority to state-level decision-making in ESSA. And Bob pointed this out very carefully in his discussion, but I emphasize it again. State decision-making will be significantly increased no matter what the future holds for us. States are going to have greater say in how they choose to help struggling schools, and they're going to have greater authority over how that money is spent. So how is this really going to impact a lot of the federal funding that's out there? Well, again, I go back to that hazy ball because it's stuck on hazy right now. We don't know what the future of some of these programs, even some of these programs listed on the slide right now, because even yesterday in Education Week, there was some discussion about the possible reduction in some of these programs, and it's being contemplated right now. But even with the haziness, let's examine 4 major initiatives and what ESSA tells us about them. First of all and foremost, as you've been hearing about today, is Title I, Part A. And you've heard about the increase set aside, that 7% for school improvement. That's an increase from 3%. But the other thing you need to know is that there's going to be more equitable funding for high schools, and also waivers that states are going to be allowed to do to offer more school-wide designation of their programs. Now let's talk a few minutes about the Carl D. Perkins Career Technical Education Grants, because career technical education is all over ESSA, and it even is being encouraged as an indicator for state report cards. Let's also talk about a new program that's being proposed under ESSA. And again, I know the hazy ball's out there and we don't know the future of this program, but we do know Title IV Block Grant, which is referred to as the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grants, enable us to focus for the first time a lot on that well-rounded, including CTE and the arts, well-rounded education, along with safety and health for our students, and also, importantly, some funding for the effective uses of technology and digital learning. So we need to keep our eye on what is going to be happening with that Title IV Block Grant. And then the other program that we often think about when we look at formula federal funding is our Title II Part A, which is actually having some additional set-aside 3% for professional development opportunities for state and district leaders. Now, despite the haziness, again, of these regulations, governors are continuing to say that they are offering a balanced approach to education in their states. In fact, the National Governors Association recently issued a frequently asked document about what do states do right now, especially given this hazy time. And here's what they said. States need to press forward, they need to look to the law, and they need to utilize it as an opportunity. So what does all this mean in terms of funding? Well, folks, what is important is that funding often follows policy, and you need to know what is happening in your state. So let's take those 4 grant initiatives that we just talked about, and let's apply them to some things that are happening and what we're seeing in states across this nation. When we look at Title I, Part A, the state of Washington is really looking at that waiver of 40% school-wide threshold for low-performing schools, and they're also looking at early learning and summer programs. There's a possibility they're going to distribute improvement funds via a formula, not as competitive, but as a formula to schools identified for comprehensive or targeted support. That's what they're looking at. When we talk about Perkins, Tennessee right now is looking at this bridge to post-secondary programs, to look at new ways to measure career readiness with its accountability framework and expand CT offerings. When we think about that Title IV Block Grant that we just mentioned, Arizona is really looking at the area of prevention in bullying, and they're also looking at technology adoption, especially for at-risk and disabled learners, and for further family engagement in the learning process. And importantly, when we look at Title II, Oregon right now is using that 3% set aside for improving equitable access to excellence in educators for all of their students. Now, those are really some of the things that we're looking at in those federal funds, but let's quickly talk about what's happening in competitive funds. There are 2 competitive grants that I want to draw your attention to. One is Promise Neighborhoods, and I saw a question down there about involving the whole community, and this is really an opportunity for involving the whole community. Now, we thought that Promise Neighborhoods was going to be out yesterday. My team is monitoring, and I have to say, I just received a text that they were able to get in touch with someone, and we know that the new date for that application to be open is being looked at late this spring. So keep watching for Promise Neighborhoods to be announced any time. And those are great opportunities. And finally, the really great opportunity when we're looking at programs, especially when we're looking at that secondary, is gaining early awareness and readiness for undergraduate programs. That program is called Year Up. We're anticipating a new competition to be held in the fall of 2017. So again, we need to keep our eye on those particular initiatives and what is happening. So to support your funding needs and to find some other funding, I encourage you to go to grantsalert.com. You can also follow us on Twitter because we're constantly monitoring and looking for that funding as funding matchmakers to meet your needs in terms of school improvement. And at that point, I'll turn it back to you, Kurt.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Paula. And thank you to Charles and Bob as well. Charles has also made his contact information available here if you're interested in learning more about the Talent Development Secondary. And yes, at this point, we're going to get to your questions here. Just first, a couple reminders. We did get a lot of comments and questions asking about accessing the slides as well as the archive recording. And yes, everyone who registered here will be getting a follow-up email with links to where you can download the slides. If you want to take a look at them again, I know there's a lot of great information contained in here. Our panelists went through, had to get through cover a lot of ground here. Very informative. So you'll have opportunity to go back over those. Also, another reminder here, if you do have a question, just enter it in the Q&A box, bottom right-hand corner of your screen here, and we'll get to as many as we can. Thanks to everybody who did ask a question here. We've got a number of questions. Let's see, that some of them came in, Bob, while you were presenting. As Paula just alluded to, there was a question there asking about the role of community involvement. Is that a part of the research here, Bob? I think you talked about the importance of both curriculum and academic experiences on the one hand, and then relationships on the other. Would community involvement kind of fall under that relationships umbrella? Thoughts on that, Bob? And just don't forget your mute button there, Bob.
Yes, there is great room for community involvement under the new ESSA school improvement things on two levels. One is that these are locally developed plans now. So if a local school district believes strongly in the power of community involvement, and there is good evidence that community involvement makes a real difference, they can then build very strong school improvement strategies that are heavily centered around community involvement. And we also know, as we said, is that in schools where you have many, many needy students that have chronically absent or get in trouble or don't get their work done, you need to recruit a second shift of adults from the community to have enough caring adults to form those relationships. So it becomes very essential to have that community involvement when you're in a school that has many, many high needs kids and only so many adults in the school building.
Okay, great, thanks. And a follow-up, kind of a similar question, someone asking, have there been any studies on these schools that you highlighted, and if social-emotional learning programs have increased student outcomes, and what's the effect of transition programs as well? Bob, I think you talked about a variety of approaches. Social-emotional learning is kind of another current hot topic. Do you know if that plays into this, or if there's research about that aspect as well?
Yeah, absolutely. There is good emerging evidence that social-emotional programs can help students academically, and also through those ADCs, make them to attend more frequently, be able to be more focused in class and get their work done, and that really building students' social strengths of sense of self-agency and sense of self-management, And that's really why we actually spent a decade building materials to help schools do that with the mastering middle grades and freshman seminar work, is that really giving you the tools to build those skills, because students need to both develop their cognitive abilities, but their ability to also just succeed in school and life, and that's really driven by social emotional abilities. And transition programs, there are good evidence-based transition programs, both between middle and high school onto college, that if you do what's been shown to work, that it could be an important component of whole school reform, but in itself not enough.
Okay, sure, thank you. Paula, this question came in while you were speaking. They just said, please elaborate on the 40% waiver. I think that was part of what.
Absolutely. Sure. And I also know, and just to let you know, I just got breaking news again because I saw a question down there. I'm going to digress just quickly and everything like that. The breaking news is that Gear Up is out. It just was announced today. The deadline for that partnership grant is April 19th, and for the state grants is April 24th. So I just wanted to let everybody know on the call, and thank you for the person that sent that message in. We just saw it right now and everything like that. So we just have breaking news. We can't stay on top of everything quick enough and everything like that. So let me talk about that waiver for this school-wide and everything like that. What that means is, under the previous authorization, under Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act, a school in which there was more than 40% of students that came from low poverty backgrounds could use Title I funds for school-wide improvement. But under ESSA, a state is permitted to grant a school a waiver from that 40% threshold after considering how much of the proposed use of those funds would actually impact student achievement. And that's what we're seeing, again, that state control or state decision-making. That's what we're seeing in the state of Washington right now, and we look for that to happen in other places. So again, the opportunity is that we can have more school-wide designations that are happening throughout our nation right now.
Okay, great. Let's see, another one for you, Bob, just asking, can you speak to the role of digital curriculum in these schools? Bob, you talked about, or Charles, if you want to weigh in as well, you talked about the importance of curriculum and the TDS working on that. Does digital curriculum play into that?
So digital curriculum can help you personalize, which is very important when you have kids coming in with different prior abilities and experiences. The thing we've learned, though, with digital curriculum in high poverty environments is you really have to pair it with that relationship. You really have to have somebody often help work with the kids on the digital environment, and that's often where the second shift of adults can come in handy. If you just set kids off by themselves to be learning from a digital environment, it often doesn't have the effects you need, because those kids need the motivation to come, be focused, get their work done, and that's driven by human relationships, whereas the digital thing, though, can help get more customized and more tailored learning opportunities to meet the kids where they are, to push them where they go. But in our experience, it only works if you pair it with that human element as well.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. Couple questions asking, Bob, and I know we've gone over time here, but we still have a lot of people in the seminar here and a lot of questions. We'll try to hit a couple more of these. Bob, just asking for your take on the impact of the Trump administration and Betsy DeVos. Do you think, do you get a sense of, looking forward, how you could sum it up, the potential impacts or the implications here?
Sure. So, I mean, it's very clear that they believe very strongly in choice and trying to find more ways to give parents choice to choose between different public schools in a district or even, private or virtual schools. And they're very clear about that, and they're very straightforward, and we have to assume they're going to try to find ways to advance that, because that's what they believe makes a difference. The check and balance on that, and that's the power of our system, is that we have checks and balances throughout, are things that, like a lot of what happens in education, is regulated by laws passed by Congress, not just actions decided by the Department of Education or even the President. So they can, at sort of the margins, they can create new programs, they can use the bully pulpit, they can look for ways to redirect some of the education money to support these things. But by and large, most of the educational efforts by the Department of Education are driven by laws passed by Congress, which to change those laws would require 60 votes in the Senate, which means it would have to be a bipartisan shift. It can't just be done on party line votes. So that's going to put a lot of sort of just check and balance on like how far they can able to use the federal government to promote choice. And then finally, many of that will come down to a local decision. I mean, I think a governor probably has more power to help push some of those things forward right now than the feds do. But I think that's what you're going to hear a lot about, and they will be cutting some of the federal programs. That's also clear. But again, there'll be some degree of pushback from Congress to mediate the extent of that.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Interesting question here asking how does a district that's considered to be a low-need, wealthy district and high-performing academically become eligible to participate in any of these programs or receive funding to implement these programs? Bob, you talked, of course, a lot about the impact of poverty and how important that is, how a lot of these low-performing schools are, of course, high-poverty districts. What about districts that aren't? If they're a little more affluent, but they still want to pursue academic excellence, are any of these programs kind of available to them, or do they concentrate on the high poverty?
Well, I mean, most of these are driven by Title I, which was designed to provide districts with additional funding to offset the impacts of poverty. So if you have very limited poverty, there's less opportunity to access them. The one where it may come into play is with the targeted schools, that even often schools that are relatively affluent and relatively successful may still well have subgroups of students like special education students or recent English language learners that struggle. And it's quite possible that in some cases that the gap between those students and the other students in the school could be large enough to trigger that they would be identified as having subgroups that are struggling, which would then make them eligible for some of the targeted intervention approaches and funding, potentially.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Let's see, maybe one more question here. Well, and I think, Bob, you just alluded to this, someone asking, is there concern about the likely cutbacks to funding in the Department of Education, including ESSA and the maintenance of effort requirement and the 7% set aside for school improvement? I think you kind of touched on that just now, Bob, but yeah, go ahead.
Very briefly, yeah. I mean, so sure, if there was to be a large cut of Title I, that would put some of the 7% at risk, but even in the most recent estimates of what might be in the proposed presidential budget for the Department of Ed, there's actually some talk of actually increasing or holding constant Title I and really taking it largely from some of the other titled programs. So far, it seems that of all the programs that are at risk, Title I is the least at risk. And again, the one that has, at some levels, the strongest congressional support that would sort of push back against major cuts. And given that the economy is in relatively decent shape now, I think that's also going to help, you know, take some of the pressure off to sort of making sure that Title I stays where it's at.
And Bob, if I can just build on what you said, one of the areas where we're seeing a lot of, if any possible cuts are going to be made, are probably in that Title II and Title IV, that block grant, that what we're seeing right now. So if any of those programs, those seem to be the most likely that we're reading about in the latest set of readings that we've done right now. And I mentioned that when we were talking and everything. And Kurt, if you don't mind, I'd like to just build off of the other one that looked for school improvement for maybe those schools that are not in that lowest performing with some fund opportunities. Please consider always things like Jacob Javits grants. We don't know in terms of where they're going to be, but those opportunities always exist, and always look for some partnerships in the new grant that's Education, Innovation, and Research and Improvement grant, the new EIR grant. there would be some opportunities for schools maybe to partner with those low-performing schools. So always think about opportunities where you could partner LEAs or your schools with other schools. And finally, don't neglect foundation and corporate funding, because they have a great opportunity for you to expand and build quality programs that you're working on out there.
And Kurt, I'd like to add to that as well. I think a previous question mentioned how might we access some of these programs. Well, the ones that are categorical for high poverty students or percentages of students, they have some limitations, but talent development doesn't discriminate. If there are, you know, more affluent districts that have pockets of students in various schools that are behind grade level or struggling in one way, shape, or form, there's no reason why we couldn't talk to you about, you know, exploring a solution.
Okay, great, and thank you for that. That's a great lead-in. I was just going to wrap things up here and mention that we did have several comments and questions asking if they're interested in learning more. I just wanted to put, Charles, your contact info slide here.
Sure.
And if there's anything you want to say about anyone who wants to get in touch with you afterwards.
Yeah, like I said, we have staff all over the country, and no matter where you are, if you have a challenge that you're dealing with and wondering if we might be able to co-create a solution based on what you've heard today, more than happy to field your outreach and get it to the right person.
Okay, great. Well, we went a few minutes over time here, but we had a large audience today and a lot of great questions, so thanks to everybody who submitted questions. And of course, on behalf of district administration, I'd like to thank our panelists here today, Dr. Robert Balfanz, Charles Hiteshew, and Dr. Paula Love. Thank you all so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. And again, thank you to our sponsor, the Talent Development Secretary at the Johns Hopkins School of Education. And of course, to everyone who joined us today in our audience, thank you as well for being here. I do hope you found our web seminar informative and useful to you. Producing events like this one is just part of our mission at DEA to inform school district leaders like you about the latest news and trends in K-12 management. You'll find more coverage about issues such as the ones we discussed here in the pages of our monthly print magazine, as well as on our website and in our free daily e-newsletter, DA Daily. And as I mentioned before, for those of you who would like to share this event with your colleagues, or if you want to go back over the presentation at your own pace, you can access it from our website by going to the URL on your screen here, where it will be posted in the archive section. And if you'd like to download the slides, you'll find instructions and a link in a thank you email that you'll receive later on today. So keep an eye out for that. So that is it for today's event. Once again, I'm Kurt Isley-Durley for District Administration on behalf of our producer, Ashley Morgan, and everyone on my production team. Goodbye, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much for joining us.